people want to be in the football industry more so than anywhere else. Football is most certainly the most litigious, most amount of disputes. At the start of the season compared to the end of the season, you're looking at anywhere between 100 to 200 disputes. The most important thing about disputes in football, and it's the same with any sport, but in football, is that it has to be done expeditiously. The role of an attorney is to represent his clients to the best of his ability within the football space. Any player, right, that is looking at getting proper representation, that they go and have a look at that list and they go on the FIFA website and see who they can and should be dealing with. You need to know what you're getting into from the start.
Now, my next guest on Behind the Boot with Super Journal, you might know him, you might not know him, a sports lawyer, passionate about training and development compensation, Evert De Bruyn. We go deeper into discussing a couple of things, as I mentioned, development compensation. We talk about dispute resolution in the PSL, some FIFA bans, and a whole lot more from a sports law perspective. Evert De Bruyn, not like Kevin De Bruyne, no.
I'll take it. Thanks.
Welcome to another episode of Behind the Boot with Super Journal. The main purpose of this podcast is mainly to educate the business of football, which will be a nice segue to talk about your networking session earlier this month. But maybe let's start by way of introduction in terms of, because a lot of people that will be coming on here, maybe people might know of them, might not know of them, what they do, because, at times the interviews can get a bit technical in terms of dealing with the dynamics of the business of football. Your day-to-day work as it pertains to, particularly, I know, maybe sports law in general, but particularly maybe as we zoom in football.
Yeah, so I'm an attorney by profession, as you know. I've been working in the football space, probably going on for about 10 plus years now. My background is predominantly dispute resolution, so, fighting, which very much fit like a glove.
You do like a fight.
I do like a fight.
I'll tell you that.
But, let's not, kick this thing off on a controversial note. So that was my background. And when I got into football for the first time, it very much was a labor of love, bit of a passion project. I was approached by some attorneys working at SAFA at the time to get involved, to see where I could help out on a pro bono basis. And very quickly that escalated into something much more. Started working with players and agents and clubs and academies. And like I said, that was 10 years ago, and it's just kind of grown from there. Very privileged to be in the space because it is something that I not only enjoy from a professional point of view, but also from a personal point of view. I'm a big fan. Don't ask me who I support. I won't give you an honest answer. But the gist of it is that I've been in the space now for quite some time. I'd like to think that I'm experienced. I'd like to think that I've built up somewhat of a reputation and that I've got the kind of...
You wouldn't be on Behind the Boot.
Well, thank you.
Reputation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's very kind of you to say. And I'd like to think that I've made some good friends and been able to contribute, towards the industry in some meaningful way. I guess we'll talk about the rest in due course. But that's me in a nutshell.
Rewarding job or thankless at times?
Both. It's the challenge that we have as attorneys is because we do the hourly grind and work and according to billable hours. As soon as you've done something of significance, you have to move on to the next one just to be able to put food on the table. But in the same breath, what you do find is that more often than not, when you've been able to right a wrong, that there is significant appreciation for what you do, and it leads to more work as the industry very much requires. So from that point of view, very rewarding, very self fulfilling in that sense. But like you said, also very, very thankless at some times because, as I'm sure you know, and many people who are in the football industry, football is a incredibly fast-paced, self-serving industry, and more often than not, as soon as you've done something well, people forget about it and turn around and want more. And that becomes that's very much the worst side of football.
Yeah, I suppose you also might have you can correct me if I'm wrong, a perspective from other sporting codes as well. How does football compare? Especially when it comes to the work that you do on a daily, disputes or
Sure.
Representing players, clubs, whatever else, SAFA, the PSL.
So I've done a bit of work in other sporting codes. I'd say that football is most certainly the most litigious, most amount of disputes, most amount of controversies on and off the pitch, most amount of.
Why though?
Well, I think it really goes down to the nuts and bolts of it, which is that football is the most supported and most followed sport in the country. So
by its very nature, it invites those type
Correct.
of things. Yeah.
It is incredibly. There's a lot of interest in it, so that means that there's a lot of desperation that comes with it. People want to be in the football industry more so than anywhere else. And that leads to people being taken advantage of. That leads to people being in constant dispute with one another in order to get what they want. So ultimately, in as much as it's different to other codes, I think the inherent competitive nature of it isn't necessarily a distinguishing feature. I do think that the people involved, the kind of characters, the kind of clubs, the players and the agents involved do make it an incredibly frustrating at times environment to be in. But for all the more reason, that's why people like myself are in business, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because that really is what the environment is at the moment. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? I guess time will tell. We'll discuss that, I guess, in a bit more detail. But from a legal point of view, incredibly challenging.
Can imagine.
And you have to be on your feet. You have to work late hours, unfortunately, because that's the nature of the industry. Not that lawyers aren't necessarily alive to that.
Mostly representing players or
anything
across the board.
Exactly.
Clubs.
So if you're involved with a player who wants to get out of a club, or you want to, if you're involved in a transfer, if you're involved in a disciplinary hearing, all these things happen quickly. The most important thing about disputes in football, and it's the same with any sport, but in football is that it has to be done expeditiously, right? It has to happen fast. We've seen so many times where things get dragged out and then by the end of the season, you're stuck in court. Right, because that's just kind of the nature of how things operate.
We'll discuss that Lassana Diarra example that went for more than almost a decade, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So expeditiousness is in dispute resolution when it comes to football very important, and oftentimes it's not dealt with as well as it probably should. But that in and of itself means that you have to be available. Always. And that's a challenge for some attorneys and for some legal professionals in this space. But it makes it so much more.
So you've had a couple of sleepless nights.
A few. I try and get a couple of hours in at least. But yes, if you see the bags under my eyes, you know where it comes from. But it's still rewarding. Every fight is a challenge.
Yeah.
Some fights are for a bigger purpose. Others are really just for bread and butter, which is a good enough purpose in and of itself. So challenging, but much more active than other sporting codes. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean there are some changes at the moment. You would have seen newly elected executive committee. Will that make your job easier, or you think more of the same, really. Obviously, the Iron Duke gets re-elected, stood unopposed, and then just a couple of changes here. Tim Sukazi comes in, Jomo Biela, and Johnny Mokhaladi with John Committees out, Rob Bernardi out, and David Tidiela, who was quite outspoken about not wanting to run for that seat anymore.
So to answer your question, does it make my job any easier? I don't know yet. I think what would have seen a significant increase in my workload would have been a scenario whereby the PSL would not have procured a new sponsor in the form of Betway. I think that's largely due to the confidence that certain people have in the leadership that remains. So I think, whether you want to be critical about what the status quo is, you need to understand that the entire infrastructure and ecosystem of professional football in South Africa has effectively has remained as a result of the work done by those people in charge at the PSL and largely Dr. Khoza in that regard, I understand. That being said, it's a partnership that I think is going to be very interesting. A lot of people have raised concerns about it being a betting company and how and to what end we involve betting companies in professional sports. I think yes, it presents a challenge, not a insurmountable one, but one that both partners in the form of Betway and the PSL will have to monitor, because I can tell you firsthand, there are a significant amount of players and people involved in football who are betting on football, and it's a problem. So that needs to be dealt with. But from a content creation and a partnership point of view, I think Betway is a very exciting opportunity. Reason being, we've seen what they've done in other codes. So I think that they will be able to add significant value in the PSL as a brand by virtue of what they've done and what the PSL has been lacking in, which is content creation and doing a good job in marketing their brand in a way that I think Betway would be able to contribute. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah.
Insofar as the specific people on the Exco in and out, once again, time will tell. The Exco in and of itself is merely a representation of what the member clubs are thinking at any given point in time about the people that are there or not there. So we'll see. I don't know any of the individuals, to such an extent to be able to comment on their capabilities. Once again, time will tell. The PSL, as a collective have, in a democratic fashion appointed these people. So let's see what happens. I'm excited about professional football for various reasons. Betting in and of itself is a partner that professional sports really has little alternative in joining up with. We've seen that with cricket as well. How it is unfortunately one of the partners that are usually more often than not front of face, and it's a challenge, but it's not insurmountable. I'm very much excited to see what we've seen, a trend with younger players being played, them being able to build on their brands, those brands being leveraged through content and the like with a partner that's as good as doing that as Betway. So excited, but time will tell. There is a concern, right, about the viability of professional football and the finances involved, as is with most sports in this country. So let's see.
Yeah, and I think the chairman and from a sponsor point of view, Betway did a really good job the other day when they were announcing that the winners of the league would get 20 million rands. They also, I think November month was, I think they called it Betting Awareness Month,
right?
And they had various stakeholders to speak into that, to make a pledge in front of all the cameras and the media that was there to say this is something that we are monitoring. And I think, which brings me to my next point. And Mobile, for instance, did a breakdown at your network session a couple of weeks ago, business of football. Tell me a little bit more about that. I know I attended the opening day. I got a lot out of it.
Yeah.
I spoke to people that usually don't answer my phone calls and reply to my text, but it was nice face to face and to get some of them to commit to come to the podcast. But we'll see about that. What were you hoping to achieve with that? Because it was one. As you would imagine, it was sports law heavy because, of course, you're a lawyer. So
I had to rely on my friends.
So you had to call a buddy. But for me, very educational in terms of what I got out of it about the dynamics of sports law, especially because there was such a heavy focus on football as well, which was my space, and I was very comfortable in trying to suck as much information out of it as possible.
So the simple answer to the question is we wanted to bring people together. So for those that haven't heard or unaware of it, we held a business of football conference over 2 days at FNB Stadium, Soccer City. We had in excess of 100 people coming through the doors over that weekend, and I
had some people texting me asking me for tickets last minute. I was like,
unfortunately, our initial expectation was very modest, and by the end of it, we realized that we probably could have sold out twice. So it just shows you the kind of appetite and desire people have 100%. To attend these things. Ultimately, the reason behind having it was to create a platform for education. It was to create a platform for networking, and to build the kind of relationships that I think will be lasting. There is a significant shortage of opportunities like that for people within the space. So a large amount of people that wanted to attend were looking for a way to enter the professional space, because doors are very often shut for educated or for hardworking people, because there are only so many opportunities. So I think it presented us with a fantastic opportunity to really just see what we can do, how we can contribute. And I'm not ashamed to say that we made absolutely no money out of it, despite what people may think.
Food was delicious, though.
It was, and that's kind of where we put the money towards, is to provide a good event and a wonderful atmosphere in order to be able to do that. And where we ended up was a desire to do another one. We've already been approached with the idea of doing it in a different venue. Although I think to their credit, our partners, Stadium Management, did a fantastic job, and we wouldn't want to necessarily go anywhere else. But all things being equal, I'm glad to hear you learned something. I didn't think that was possible, to be honest. But I think we presented an opportunity to people, and I think a lot of people found incredible value from it, and hopefully the next one will be even better, because it was a learning experience for us as well. I've never done an event, to be the front runner and to have the people involved, that we did, CEOs in sport, and stadium management. Wonderful experience. We've had a lot of good feedback, and we hope to have another one. But for the very same reason you're doing this podcast, it's about educating, it's about breaking down barriers, and I think we achieved that.
I did leave with a slight question mark, given the engagements with all the lawyer talk. What is the difference between an agent and an attorney? Because there was quite a huge overlap as I listened to a couple of presentations from various sports attorneys.
Sure. So I think in principle, just to start off with the easy answer, the role of an attorney is to represent his clients to the best of his ability within the football space. That very much means a number of things, but ultimately to provide advice with the necessary experience and integrity. As you know, I'm also a licensed FIFA agent, as are many attorneys and or agents in the space.
So you passed that exam, difficult exam.
Yes.
Smart guy.
I think when you have the benefit and the privilege of a tertiary education, like a lot of the colleagues that have passed, it kind of gears you and sets you up for it. There are a lot of good agents, in the conventional sense that I know are struggling to pass it. So the reality of it is, if you think about the test being the only measure of being an agent or not, maybe that's somewhat misleading. But let's get back to the question. The difference between an agent and an attorney very much then comes down to what is an agent. And I think fundamentally speaking, a lot of people particularly players, particularly clubs. An agent, or the role of an agent, means and can mean very different things. And it really ultimately just depends on what a specific agent has been asked to do. If you're a player agent, which a lot of people like to think that they are, then in that context, your job is not particularly dissimilar to that of an attorney who is, solely looking after the interests of his client.
Yeah.
But often within a small market like South Africa, that becomes a problem because there are only so many employers, right?
That's true.
So if you are going to vociferously represent your client and your client's interest, and that interest does not necessarily align with what a club wants, you're going to find yourself on the bad side of a potential employer for a future client, or a paymaster in the sense of a club, because we all know that clubs are ultimately the one that control the purse strings in this country. And so it becomes a very challenging affair in South Africa, for an agent who wants to do the best thing for his player, because ultimately he's the one, he gets paid by the clubs. People have this misconception that a player is the one that pays an agent. It should be like that, but in the South African context, it very seldomly is. So, once again, this is an industry sort of, not a secret, but a practice, is that an agent will work for a player. He'll have a representation agreement with a player, but he will sign an agreement which effectively means that he's getting paid by the club on the club's behalf for recruiting the player, which is theoretically speaking not really how it should work. And it creates a significant amount of consternation and conflict. But unfortunately, the players, most of which are either ignorant or not properly represented, or could not care, just because they're so they're chasing an opportunity, will very seldomly raise any issues about it. And of course, when a year, 2 years down the line, maybe the player's not playing, it's not in the coach's plans, then the inevitable conversation comes up. Well, we need to terminate your contract and we'll give you, a couple of months instead of the full and then what does that agent do? Does he create the problem for himself for future business with the club? Does he do his client the disservice of telling him to agree to a termination when there's no other options available for him to generate an income? So it creates a very unbalanced scenario. And more often than not, that's where I enter the fray. And unfortunately, whether that's to fight with an agent, whether that's to fight with a player or to fight with a club, those are all possibilities. But that's unfortunately the kind of disputes that you get involved with when you work in a small market like South Africa. And it's no discredit to the people and the clubs. And
it is what it is.
It is what it is. And I think if there's anything that I am advocating for, is for South African clubs, players and agents to explore bigger and better markets abroad. Even if it's, the short-term gain isn't as beneficial, because what I think we've done is we've kind of isolated ourselves. We've got the wealth and the riches that, is bestowed upon us by the PSL, and I'm talking about clubs and players, but it has isolated us, in terms of being able to give our players opportunities in other areas. And that's why you have this very strange dynamic and very confrontational dynamic. Because of the lack of opportunity, people are willing to do very, very strange things. And unfortunately, you see that a lot. But that being said, a good agent will always represent the best interest of his player.
Like emphasis on a good agent, because the reality is there are some fly-by-nights out there.
Right. So we now have the measure of the exam. So if the exam is now the measure, right, then you would encourage people to only deal with licensed agents. And that is across the board the position that they should take. So
that document that's sort of circulating with the names of agents that have passed, it's an authentic document. I think it's SAFA sort of encourage. I don't know if they are telling the league as the mother body or encouraging the league to work with a particular group that's passed the exam and now.
So I've seen the document. I believe it's legitimate. It's basically just a letter from from SAFA saying to PSL clubs, these are the agents that are licensed within South Africa. Although the within South Africa part is somewhat misleading because the license extends internationally.
It's a FIFA license.
Exactly. So you don't
doesn't limit
there's
you
no-
to only work
exactly.
within the confines of
If
SA.
you are living in South Africa, then SAFA has jurisdiction over you in order to regulate your affairs. But ultimately, the point is this. Will any of the clubs adhere to that? They should. Who's going to intervene and start?
Yeah, I mean, I
holding
suppose
people to
if it's not written into the constitution or it's a law.
Well, theoretically, it's a
yeah.
FIFA. It's a FIFA law,
It's a FIFA
and
law.
it's now a SAFA law because
Yeah.
SAFA have issued and published their own regulations as well. So
But
theoretically,
who will police that?
well, technically speaking, SAFA should.
Yeah.
But I'm told they have a lot more, pressing things to deal with.
Yeah.
So, realistically speaking, a national association should govern agents and agents' conduct. But I find it difficult to imagine how SAFA, with the resources they have at their disposal, will take agents, licensed or otherwise, to task, or clubs, right, dealing with licensed or unlicensed agents. So, these are one of the things that we'd like our industry to be serious about. Hopefully that will happen, and hopefully that will change. But I'm not holding my breath and thinking that it's going to happen anytime soon. But all things being equal, what you can do and what I would advocate for is any player, right, that is looking at getting proper representation, that they go and have a look at that list and they go on the FIFA website and see who they can and should be dealing with. But ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, the industry is very desperate. The people in the industry are very desperate for opportunity, and unfortunately that leads to exploitation. So we can only try and help and educate. But ultimately, there are very good agents.
Yeah.
And just to get back to maybe the issue we spoke about earlier, is what the difference is. There are also agents that are just looking out for clubs, that are being mandated by clubs to either sell a player or to recruit a player. That's a very different dynamic to a player agent in the strict sense. And people need to know that an agent can take many roles, and it's important to know which role and which hat he's wearing at any given point. Because if you don't know that, you're going to get exploited and you're going to get taken advantage of, and you are going to moan to a football lawyer, right, 1 year into your contract about having signed a 5-year contract for nothing. And there's very little that I can do, or any of my colleagues can do about that. You need to know what you're getting into from the start. And what I've been seeing exceedingly more and more is young players and their parents seeking out proper guidance and counsel to try and see what the best way is of dealing with it. Even if it's having been approached by an agent. Is this agent legitimate?
Yeah.
Is it somebody we can trust? Does he have a decent enough reputation?
Yeah.
What do we need to look out for? These are very valuable conversations to have, even if you have to lay out some funds in order to have it up front, because the loss that you can suffer later on is exponentially more.
Absolutely.
So that's the kind of value that you would want. A lot of agents that are lawyers can give you the same advice. So it's important to know that the person you're engaging with is qualified and knows what they're doing.
So you have come across a number of disputes in this sense, and in another sense, I guess. And is it as complicated as it sounds when we talk disputes? I mean, the PSL, and I suppose across the world as well, is littered with disputes. I don't know. I mean, you will know better how many cases the DRC sits with on a monthly or even a weekly basis in the South African context.
So I can't give an exact number because I don't know, but if you track sort of, all legal cases have case numbers. So if you, at the start of the season compared to the end of the season, you're looking at anywhere between 100 to 200 disputes.
In one full season.
Yes, in one season.
That's about more than 100 in a space of 8 months or so, give or take.
Yes. So ultimately,
that's a lot.
A large amount of those disputes are purely money claims. So in other words, clubs not paying players. There are also other disputes relating to clubs withholding clearances, right? Other disputes in the sense of being unfairly dismissed, right? And then, of course, development compensation claims between PSL clubs, transfer fees not being paid. So these are the bread and butter kind of things that you see more often than not at the PSL.
And is it mostly top flight, or it's second tier?
That's difficult to answer. I would say to you that those kind of disputes largely emanate from financial struggles.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Which leads to breach of contract.
Correct.
Yeah.
So more often than not, if a club has signed 10 players halfway through the season, they need to readjust because they're doing poorly, but the budget won't allow it. What they'll just do is unfairly dismiss or just not pay players, fill those numbers up with new players who they're paying, and then 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, they eventually have to fork out. And you see some quite...
But it also feels like a more costly exercise for clubs.
It is a more costly. But
so
now
why
you
do they
to,
get into it in the first place?
Because they utilize spurious methods in order to offset a large amount of the damage that they would suffer from a financial point of view. One of these ways is just withholding clearances, right? So in other words, what tends to happen is a player, let's say, hasn't been paid for 3 months. He's not being played, but they're withholding his clearance. He wants to go and make a living elsewhere. So what ends up happening is now he has to go and find another club. But he can't do that without his clearance. So they're withholding his clearance in order to try and frustrate him, and then saying to him, okay, we'll give you your clearance, but you have to waive. And
you have to agree to a certain settlement amount.
Well, not even a settlement.
Yeah. Or just walk away free.
Walk away from what we owe you, and we're not paying you a cent.
And we can let you get another job somewhere else.
And you can go on your merry way. Now, of course, that's a very undesirable and very unfair scenario, but that unfortunately happens quite a lot. What also happens is players being unfairly dismissed. Now, of course, there are also situations where players get fairly dismissed, right? So, what we see often is also unfair dismissals, proper disciplinary proceedings not being taken, having taken place, the imposition of unfair sanctions and so on and so forth. What I think is also becoming of increasing concern is just the length. Remember, I spoke earlier about the expeditious nature that you want sporting cases to be dealt with, and that's being to some extent delayed, largely because of people like myself, right, wanting to delay. But ultimately, and I'm not saying I want to delay, I'm saying, when lawyers get involved, there usually is a completely different dynamic. But ultimately, also because of the fact that having to appoint a lawyer is expensive. And we would have hoped that certain other players, like the Players Union, or either one of them, there's a few apparently now, getting involved and providing the service for free, or at least providing any kind of service.
Yes.
But the reason myself and other colleagues like us are in this environment is because there's no faith in those other institutions.
Institutions.
So I think once that gets sorted out, I think another aspect of it is we've seen certain clubs getting banned by FIFA. Now, the FIFA ban is nothing more than a consequence of doing exactly the same thing, which is not paying players and not honoring contracts. But FIFA have a very different approach, which is significantly more severe than the PSL. And the PSL, they say to you, here's a platform, you can bring your case. It might take a while. Maybe you'll get it and we'll deduct it off the grant if you are successful. But it's become almost like a foregone conclusion to some clubs. Okay, well, we've lost the case. It'll get deducted from our grant in a couple of months. But there's no real other sanction.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think I read this in one of the FIFA, on player transfers and that. Does FIFA not encourage national, I suppose, in a sense they do, national dispute resolution chambers to say, deal with it there first before you bring it to us? But I suppose there are, like in the case in point, in a South African context, you've had a Royal AM, Polokwane City, Richards Bay, Chippa, Kaizer Chiefs. The players then went straight to FIFA.
Right.
Is it? I know it's a law.
Well, it's actually much more complicated than what it probably should be. And so I don't want to bore your audience. But effectively, the reason why international players can go straight to FIFA is because our national dispute resolution setup, as it were, is not compliant with FIFA minimum regulations at this point in time.
So that's probably what the chairman was talking about when he said they've started conversations about trying to make sure the national DRC is a lot stronger.
Within the PSL confines and the PSL setup, it's fine. it's compliant.
Yes.
The challenge is with SAFA. SAFA need to implement an appeal process that complies with these minimum requirements, which they've known about and which they haven't done for quite some time.
What are those minimum?
These requirements would be anything from having independent people appointed by. So I think it's there needs to be a panel, players union appointees, club appointees, and then a mixture gets appointed of 3 people. These are the very basics of an independent tribunal.
Yeah.
So those regulations and
they seem pretty.
They're very straightforward.
Yes, so
absolutely.
Maybe is it a lack of trying from the mother body to try and?
I mean, I don't want to be. It's something that can be fixed very quickly.
Yes.
You have an NEC meeting or a, just a it's not something that changing your regulations is actually very simple. It's something I've tried to get across to them, but they, like I said, they probably have better things to do. But ultimately, once that's done, then yes, we would be able to see international cases being dealt with in South Africa. Is that a good thing? I guess clubs would say yes, because then it lends itself to a longer
but the players process. Probably
the process at FIFA is actually very simple. You just file a couple of documents. From a timing point of view, you have a decision within 2 to 3 months. And FIFA, and I say this unashamedly, are very pro-player. They set minimum standards, and they say if you haven't complied with this, we're going to fine in favor of the player.
Because their main aim is always to try to protect the player first.
Where in South Africa, we have a very much pro-club sentiment.
Yes, because the body is made up of member clubs.
So the argument then, is the PSL DRC then inherently independent? A lot of people have complained about it.
Yes.
But ultimately, you have to accept that those people that sit on those tribunals on the DRC are not affiliated to the PSL. So I'm not going to make a case that they're not independent.
Yeah. Do you think international players to some degree also are taking advantage of the situation? Because I mean the growing number of clubs in the PSL being banned by FIFA is alarming, and one wonders whether. Let me make an example with Kaizer Chiefs. They did eventually get that FIFA ban with the Madagascar player, but from what I read with the documents, it sounded like I don't know. There was could have been a lot of chance taking there, whereas other cases seem pretty straightforward. Let me say TX Galaxy or Samir Nukovic proved, beyond doubt that he was there. He wasn't injured. He reported for duty. He even played in one of the friendly matches. And then suddenly he was given 30 days notice that you should be out of here.
Let me rather not talk directly about any specific club.
Yeah.
I'll talk about hypotheticals. So I think to a large extent, there's a significant amount of ignorance or a significant amount of arrogance sometimes from clubs, particularly clubs that are entering the PSL for the first time or perhaps haven't negotiated or dealt with foreign players as frequently as they have local players. Is there advantage being taken of clubs? Yes, because they allow themselves to be taken advantage of. And it's not advantage. You are doing your best work for your player, right? So if you have a contract that says you have to pay me X amount on Y date and you don't do that and you think you're going to walk away, right, without having any consequences imposed on you, then you are either ignorant or you're arrogant, unfortunately. But I think clubs are getting wise to it, right? They are learning. I think, in certain instances, the consequences that get imposed cause them to revisit their approach in terms of signing players. Foreign players contribute a significant in terms of talent and in terms of a completely different, flavor to our local football, which I think is a positive thing.
Yeah.
And, not wanting to sign a foreign player merely because you think that you're going to get screwed by the agent or the lawyer behind it is a very bad, business model.
Yeah.
What you should be doing is saying, okay, well, here's his contract. Let me pay him what I can afford to pay him and make sure that I honor that contract for the duration thereof. That's a very simple business model, and with all due respect, it's one that applies to every other industry that I'm aware of. So thinking that you're getting taken advantage of by players through their agents or their representatives, merely because you don't want to stick to the payment terms is your fault, not theirs. So maybe what you should be doing is not trying to take advantage of them. But in the same breath, it kind of shows you the complete disparity between how South African players are being dealt with and how international players are being dealt with, because the standards of what the consequences are so significantly different.
And someone can also easily turn it around and say the clubs also, maybe by way of ignorance or taking advantage, whatever the case may be, do think that they can exploit or take advantage of the fact that they bring a player in for a tryout from, whichever other African country. As soon as the coach feels, maybe not as good as we thought, but they've given him a contract, they think the player can just leave willy-nilly.
Correct. I think the dynamic and the intricacies of a international transfer, particularly when you're taking a foreign player coming from a foreign country, requires a significant amount of due diligence on the part of the club that comes, the South African club that wants to sign the player. A reason being is that, firstly, FIFA laws and regulations are applicable. Those laws and regulations are very much unknown to a large majority of the clubs and administrators. And so for that reason alone, you need to make sure, either by virtue of employing people like myself or employing people with a requisite amount of experience within the industry, to know what to look out for and to know how to go about ensuring that you're doing business in a way that is not going to compromise you at a later stage. So that being the case, hopefully indirectly through trial and error, clubs will elevate their own skill sets and their own knowledge about how to do business, not only within South Africa but internationally, and that will increase the level of the football and football administrators in our country. We can only hope.
How far are we from getting this a national DRC that's strong, that that clubs and players can rely on without a shadow of a doubt? I know that's a stretch to say without a shadow of a doubt. There's always, and not everything is 100%. But how far are we from fully complying with the FIFA requirements?
Your question really, it can be answered in two ways, but I'll try my best. The first one is what appetite is there from the stakeholders to get it done, right? Stakeholders being predominantly SAFA, the PSL, players' unions. If the appetite is there, it can be done in a matter of weeks. So how far are we? We are weeks away at any given point in time.
Wow, okay.
To get it implemented and to get it done. But it's not happening. So unfortunately, we are,
because the impression that it gives is that we are too far away. But
once again, it's not a question of implementation. Implementation can happen quickly. The buy-in, the stakeholders all sitting together and saying, let's work towards doing this, because it's really a policy issue, right? Policy issue in the sense of, what do we want? How do we want disputes in football, which is inevitable, right? If there's money, there's going to be lawyers, right? How are we going to create an environment that is conducive to resolving disputes expeditiously, right? To resolve disputes in a way that is cheap, right, and affordable, particularly to players who are more often than not financially compromised, and to do it in a way that has integrity. So ultimately, we are not far. But we're never going to get there until we have the buy-in from all the stakeholders collectively in order to get there.
Okay. I need a minute to.
It's not complicated.
Because
the challenge
to know that we are so close, but yet so far, is crazy. Would it be the same argument with it's the word that keeps being thrown around quite a lot, collective bargaining arrangement, minimum wage in South African football, those kind of things? Is it kind of similar, or that's more complex?
It is more complex only because there are a lot more gears that need to shift. But once again,
maybe for the benefit of listeners and viewers, what is ideally a collective bargaining agreement?
Well, I mean, a collective bargaining agreement inherently presupposes that it's role players within the industry, but most importantly the players, because they are, the most disenfranchised group out of all of them, coming to the party and saying, okay, well, let's set some minimum standards, right? If you're going to be a player that's playing in the PSL, even on your first appearance, you get paid X amount, right? And I'm talking about a living wage. I'm not talking about the 5 and 10,000 rand.
Yeah, we had Lance Davids here
Yes.
telling us that their players are still earn 1,000.
No, it's despicable. But we also need to appreciate that players within the PSL come and go. You know, the lifespan of an average PSL player, I would estimate, is probably less than 3 years. And largely because of the ever-changing dynamic, particularly at the lower level of football. So implementing a minimum wage, I think, is possible. But when you already have a scenario where a lot of clubs aren't even just paying salaries, you know, how is that even going to be feasible and work?
Yeah.
And secondly, you know, talking about, pension funds and all these things, same thing, right? Implementing it actually takes a hell of a lot of work.
So we could never really have maybe not never, have a situation where, may his soul rest in peace, Andile Ngonga came back to South Africa playing for Mamelodi Sundowns and was telling us in an interview that he had about 30 million plus saved up in his pension fund for all the years playing in Belgium.
I find it unlikely to think that a large amount of our players would want to agree to a pension fund scheme.
Sure.
And I say that because, for reasons that we've already discussed, they're not being paid particularly well. Those that are being paid well for the first time in their lives have several mouths to feed. So more often than not, you know, yes, we see certain players driving around in fancy cars, but they are more the exception to the rule. You know, those are the 1, 2, 3%ers. The rest of the guys are barely making enough money to get by, and to a large extent, probably don't have the ability to contribute an amount towards, you know, a pension scheme.
Yeah.
Or
so there are a lot of factors, you know,
correct,
among
and,
them.
and that doesn't mean that they shouldn't.
Yes, of course.
Right? And if you want to get that to happen, you need not only the players' union, but you need the PSL, you need the clubs. Because remember, it's going to be the club that takes the money out of their salary and contributes it to the fund. And in order for that to happen, you need to be sure that the clubs that you are relying and putting that trust in
honor their
obligations. But that's difficult in an environment where a lot of clubs aren't paying salaries.
Yeah.
It's also difficult in an environment where a lot of clubs aren't paying tax. You know, so you know, these are some of the things that need to be resolved before we can ever legitimately and realistically implement pension fund schemes and, you know, a minimum wage. So a lot of hard work still needs to be done. It's not impossible.
But can some clubs do it on their own? I suppose they can. With the, you know, the Chiefs have MedShield and so on.
I'm pretty sure there are clubs in this country that do it.
Yeah.
But they're the exception to the rule.
Yeah. What would you? Is there a recommendation? Let me start there. Is there a recommendation for a minimum wage for a top flight or let me start professional, being second tier, and then even first division minimum wage?
That's difficult. And I think the reason for that is largely due to the fact that there are some clubs that are so well ahead of in terms of means than others.
Yeah.
So you have to recommend it at a very base level, assuming that the club or the minimum wage is going to be determined off of the smallest club and the club with the smallest means. But I cannot.
So if you do that, then we are on a hiding to nothing then.
Well, I think that's, you know, but it's also very, very unreasonable to expect a club who is in the PSL, right, maybe with a very limited or non-existent legacy, or
recently promoted, or,
you know, maybe the owner has done it through hard work and not because he's, you know, got money in the bank from other endeavors.
Yeah.
To now expect them to pay a squad of 30 players at the very least, you know, 20,000 rand per month.
Yeah.
You would think that they do, but
I can tell you now, I know a few players that even have donned the Bafana jersey and are not taking home more than 20,000.
So if you start putting those expectations down on those kind of clubs, you might be having the exact opposite, you know, sort of reaction or effect that you want. But if you have a strong leadership at the PSL, and if you get everybody to buy into this notion, you theoretically shouldn't have a problem. But whether it happens or not is a different story altogether.
Sure. From what you know, working in disputes and, helping players with contracts or whatever else you help them with, is there kind of like an average base of what a top flight player is earning at the moment? And that seems to be, this would be a good starting point for a minimum wage in the top flight division. Maybe lesser so the second tier, but in the top flight at least, where we know for sure that each club gets 2 million rands for a grant, and then obviously it depends on whatever else sponsorship.
Once again,
they have,
it's very difficult to say that, and I know if I give you an answer, somebody else is going to disagree with me. But I think for a PSL player that's at the very least in their first, second, third year of playing, anything between 25 to 50 would be a reasonable, and to say that minimum wage starts at 25,000 rand, you'll have club owners saying, well, no, we can't do that. But
because would that then mean a player that's coming from the Diski Challenge, for instance, as soon as they get a professional contract, they have to sign?
Well, you could do it in a number of different ways, right? So you could have them on a Diski contract and play Diski, right? But if you have a standard form agreement that is floating around in the PSL, nothing prevents you from including a clause or some addendum
saying there should be a progression phase for a Diski Challenge player.
Let's say you get paid 10,000 in the Diski, or 5,000, or 1,000, right? It's a development setup,
league,
right? But as a standard, in terms of the collective bargaining agreement, like we have with rugby, for argument's sake, if you get promoted and selected and you are registered as part of the first team, then irrespective of what your contract says, that section comes into place, which says then now you automatically have to, as of the, let's say, end of this month or the end of the following month, start earning 25,000 rand per month. That would be very encouraging, but it's a financial commitment that a lot of clubs are unwilling to probably make at this point in time, for reasons that we've already discussed, which is halfway through the season you might want to get rid of half your squad, and you're looking, and now you have to promote players,
which is a reality. We saw it with Swallows.
Exactly. Now, it once again, it's a catch-22. Hopefully, players will know what their value is, and be able to still leverage that. But that's also a challenge in a market environment where there are so many good players, or at least so many options for clubs to sign. It's an ideal. It's where we want to be. Hopefully, one day we're still some way from it. But we have a fantastic foundation to build off of. The PSL is a R1 billion, business. So, we need to start lifting the level of everybody involved so that it can remain a R1 billion business and hopefully be a 2 billion rand or 3 or 4 or 5. And there's no reason it shouldn't. We have, the audience, we have, corporates who are looking at an opportunity to get involved in the same way they have with rugby and cricket, and I believe it's just around the corner. But it means that we need to we need to up the game. We need to lift the level of the entire PSL and the industry as a whole before corporates and commercial partners will take it serious.
Final question: would this then open the door for conversations about image rights and trademark or whatever, or because of that still being an issue, us being so far behind, that conversation is also like...
You see, the challenge with image rights, in my personal opinion, is that it's not something that our players are doing well, right? And when I say that, perhaps let me give some context. Players do not develop their image, right? Clubs develop their image.
100%.
So when you are a young player coming through the ranks of Kaizer Chiefs,
nobody knows you.
Nobody knows you before you signed.
Yeah.
Right? It's Kaizer Chiefs that develop your brand, right? So ultimately, are you then entitled to image rights? How do you negotiate that? How do you broker that? It's very challenging in South African market, because if you want to go overseas, your image rights are not really the same value as they are in South Africa. So the image rights situation in South Africa is very much dependent on the clubs. So I'm I'm not convinced that image rights are really as relevant in South Africa as it probably should be. But ultimately, hopefully, that will change as our football continues to level up, right? As our football becomes, the kind of credible business that it can be, where you have, billboards of our young players and our national team players, adorning the streets. That's where we want to be. We're getting there slowly. I know of brand ambassadors and people within that space that are working with the young players to build their brand, to add value, to make them, distinguishable from just the club to being a player in his own right. And there's a lot of value in that. Are we going to get to a point where it's being utilized and leveraged properly? Probably not soon.
I wanted to close it off, but I can't let you go before I ask I think you touched on it in the business of football session, that Lassana Diarra case. Will we ever, and obviously we'll try and make it brief, will we ever have a situation where in a South African context where a player can just freely walk away and go find employment elsewhere? Because clubs terminate contracts all the time, and it seems like, unless a player goes directly to FIFA and they get punished by way of those FIFA bans, half the time, maybe most of the time, they get away with these terminations, and the player is the one that suffers looking for employment. Would we ever get a situation where it's the other way around?
At the moment,
at least it's how I'm sort of understanding the Diarra case study.
So let's start off, before we talk about Diarra, let's just talk about the tug of war that is currently at play. People seem to want to apply normal labor law to a dismissal, in the sense of, a football player is no different to any employee. And therefore, the consequences in the form of an unfair dismissal should follow, up to a maximum of 12 months salary or 24, in certain circumstances. But ultimately, I think what people lose sight of is the fact that football is an incredibly unique industry. So if you are an employer, club in the South African context, and you think that it's fair that you can dismiss a player even if he's got a 3-year contract and only give him 3 months, then you're kind of missing the point, because on the other end of the spectrum, you as a club hold the rights to that player, and by holding the rights to that player, you have the right to generate a quite significant profit if you do things the right way, right, from that player and his contractual situation. But that balance is very seldomly understood in our context within South Africa, and that's what effectively FIFA have tried to rectify by punishing clubs, by ordering full contract value, sporting sanctions in some instances. So they understand that balance. In South Africa, I don't think we do. And we see that by recent findings in the DRC itself. But for all intents and purposes, a player needs to be compensated in a way that's fair and reasonable within the footballing context, not only the labor law context. So to get back to your question, at this point in time, the Diarra case has opened a couple of questions, particularly in the European market, most predominantly because the consequences that players would usually face from terminating their contracts earlier than the expiry date would be that they would be banned, they would be fined, they would be their new club would be held liable for whatever losses there were. So it became increasingly unpalatable for players to just move as and when they wanted. That's now changed with this outcome. We don't know really yet where it's going to land. There are certain contingencies that certain clubs are putting in place. In Spain, we've seen it for years because they saw this was going to happen. Put in clauses which said, okay, well, if you do that, you can buy it out, but that's the value of your contract. Somewhat overinflated in some cases, but at least they've kind of preempted it, and I suspect that's probably where things will go.
And FIFA themselves have said that they're gonna relook at the model.
Exactly. So within the South African context, we have another hurdle. That hurdle is what we call specific performance. Specific performance presupposes that you as an employee or as a football player can be forced by way of a court order or an order from the DRC to remain at your club without being able to just tear up your contract and walk away. It emanates from the Egerson and Santos case all those years ago, and that's still the jurisprudence that's being followed in our country. So in South Africa, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the Diarra effect is going to be felt, because it is complicated, unfortunately. But ultimately, what I suspect the Diarra case will do is it will hopefully give players a bit more leverage in terms of how they can value themselves. But in a market like South Africa, where everybody's desperate for opportunity, that could be difficult sometimes.
Oof. Yeah. Okay. Ended on.
We can talk about some more things.
No. But it was good. It was good just to get your perspective on that. Evert, thanks so much. I think we definitely need some part 2 of some sort, because I'm looking at my questions and notes here. I feel like we barely scratched the surface.
Can we cut it? And then there's one topic you forgot to talk about, which I'm very passionate about, which I would love to consider.
Which is?
The training and development.
Yes, I think we can. Let's go ahead.
It's going to take 5 minutes. So ask me the question and we'll get there.
Yeah, let's go ahead. So we'll edit this part in. Yeah. So another question, which has been a bone of contention among clubs, players, agents, and sports lawyers, development compensation.
So in principle, the development compensation scheme, training and development compensation, and solidarity is something that FIFA developed about 20 years ago. It ultimately presupposes that money should flow down, right? So we see these big transfer fees being paid for players, and ultimately FIFA said, well, those fees need to be apportioned and need to flow down into the ecosystem, so that people that are doing proper footballing development need to be compensated. This is how you create a footballing ecosystem that's sustainable. So in principle, within the FIFA context, the international context, and how it works in most European countries, is rules and regulations dictate that, and it seems to be working quite well there. In South Africa, we have somewhat of a challenge. That challenge largely comes down to...
We always have challenges in South Africa.
It doesn't mean that we can't fix them. It just, we need to discuss them and point them out. But ultimately, within the South African context, first issue is once again a lack of knowledge and an understanding. So if a player signs his first professional contract, all the clubs that participated in his development should receive a fee. And if a player is transferred for value, so in other words, for a transfer fee, 5% of that should be distributed to the clubs. And ultimately, once again, there's a certain amount of misunderstanding. So the moment an academy club, let's say School of Excellence for argument's sake, just to give an example, because they're very successful in what they do, they send the player, or a player signs, they can't withhold the clearance because he's an amateur. A player goes to the Sundowns Academy for argument's sake. Nothing is due there. It's only when that player, 1 out of 1,000 or 100,000, right, signs a pro contract and is registered, that they're entitled to something. And a lot of clubs misunderstand that just because he goes to the academy of a pro club, it doesn't entitle them to anything. Only when that player signs a pro contract. The other challenge is that the PSL have regulations govern this, but that's only applicable to PSL clubs. So a PSL club that develops a player and then loses him to another PSL club will be entitled to something, right? If you're not part of the PSL rules, right, you fall under the SAFA rules. The SAFA rules are there. They exist. The challenge is there's no numbers. PSL, you develop a player, 50,000 or 25 if you're an NFD club, when he moves per season. There's no regulation or equivalent schedule of fees, right, for amateur clubs. So if you're an LFA club, across age groups, let's say 12, 14, 16, 18, one of your players goes and signs eventually a professional contract, you should be entitled to something. The rules say you should be. What that amount is, there's no reference to that. So unfortunately, we're kind of sitting in this black hole, and what a very few number of professional clubs are doing is they are contributing because they understand the value of contributing to this ecosystem. But I'm talking about 2 or 3 clubs, not 10 or 20 clubs.
Sure.
And they're also understanding the value of giving back to grassroots, because they know that if there are clubs doing good development work, those clubs would advocate for those players that they're developing to go to them and to build those relationships, because there's a pre-existing understanding.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of PSL clubs are losing out on this because they don't want to do it. Why would they want to pay for something if they can get it for free? That's very much for 2 decades been the approach. So it is changing, but the rules aren't changing. Once again, we're talking about, the things that SAFA could do better. This is one of them. 12 years, that regulation has been in place and they still haven't changed it. So hopefully that'll change soon, and we can actually go to our LFA clubs and our academy clubs and say, guys, we've now implemented these regulations. You're going to get 10,000 or 20,000 for every player per year that you've
Give
developed.
them the appetite, incentivize them.
But exactly.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of people don't see is the hard work that local community coaches and academies put in. It's not just coaching. These are parents of players in their own right. And if they are compensated, right, even in the smallest amounts, right, it's encouraging to be able to say, well, we developed this player, we got something for it, let's try and do better next time. We'll reinvest the money into facilities or equipment or whatever the case might be. And you encourage the entire market, right, to change and adapt towards that. We'll be so much better for it instead of waiting for government to intervene. It's not government's field to necessarily get involved in this kind of thing. Let's sort it out ourselves. We can. Right? Other people are doing it.
We have the resources to pull it off.
Absolutely. And we have the appetite, and we have good people on the ground doing the hard work, and they're not getting recognition. So until that changes, we're going to just slowly move on and move on and move on. Or we can just, do the right thing and aggressively manufacture the change that we want.
Yeah. I'm hoping one of my next guests will be someone who has told me that he's been trying to work at this. I don't know how much progress he's made in Advocate Debo Motlanthe. He will be on the podcast soon, and I'm gonna pose this question to him. And I think also at some point we'll need part 2 on just development, training, and compensation, because I've done a series of stories over the years, and I'm sad to say I always come back and nothing has changed from what I wrote 5 years ago about this topic.
It's when you speak to SAFA and the people in their building, they will tell you that they advocate for it. It's their job to, right? They are responsible for youth football and youth development. But somewhere along the line, for all the good that certain people want to do in the building, it just doesn't translate and reach the point where there's meaningful, consequences. So it is going to be the foundation, I believe, of our football development for decades and centuries to come. But we need to get it right. And I think at this point in time, there's a lot of friction, particularly from clubs that don't want to have an extra line item on their budget, So they would probably want to avoid it, and why they aren't particularly, encouraging when you talk to them about it. But you need to find a workable way. Find out from them what they can afford, right? I know it's a difficult conversation to have, but, fair value. Everybody needs to be compensated for the hard work that they do. Expecting anything else is going to cause anarchy.
100%. And the chat said amen.